a little bit about myself. Um, I am Doherty. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an educational developer in teaching development with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. Some of the faces in the room I recognize, some of you I'm getting to meet for the first time, so that's always really exciting. Just a little bit about myself. I have been with TMU for about a year and a half now. Prior to that, I was a teaching professor at Emmanuel College, which is a part of U of T in a complicated way. And I got my PhD in religious studies in 2017 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So here at TMU, I support the Faculty of the Arts, and I also do work with generative AI and indigenous initiatives and the Excellence in Teaching program. So those are all vectors on which we might have encountered one another. So today I'm going to be quickly going over the goals for the talk, giving you a little bit of groundwork just to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to what we're talking about today. And then I'll be spending most of the time describing sort of a three-pronged strategy for dealing with generative AI when you're designing your writing assignments. So in other words, given that generative AI is now widely available to students, how should we design our writing assignments? So I'll be addressing three prongs to that strategy: motivating students to write, revising your assignments to keep in mind the existence of generative AI, and tuning your rubrics to emphasize those skills that generative AI programs tend to be worse at, and emphasizing those skills that students tend to be better at. Finally, we'll have a little bit of time for discussion at the end. I'm sure that many of you have particular questions or concerns when you're thinking about this upcoming semester. So these are our main goals. You'll learn how to motivate students to write. You'll learn how to modify your writing assignments to make them not only meaningful, which is something I'm sure many of you are already invested in doing, but also making them resilient to student use of generative AI. And I want to be really clear that when I say resilient, what I mean is that I'm not opposed philosophically to the idea that students might use generative AI in assignments in a way that is structured and approved by you, the course instructor. What I want to try to make sure is that as much as we can, given the pace at which this is moving and the fact that everything we're talking about might be somewhat out of date by next year, I want to, as much as I can, make sure that assignments here are meaningful and helpful for students, whether or not they use generative AI, and that students who use generative AI don't necessarily gain an advantage over students that do use generative AI. So that will also come up when we're thinking about the third goal, adjusting your rubrics to emphasize human skills. So a very brief introduction to the terminology that we use in this field. When we speak about artificial intelligence, we're speaking really, really broadly. We're talking about any computer program which learns and adapts to new information. When we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about a subset of AI programs which, based on a large amount of training data, create genuinely new inputs. So they don't just spit out what's in their training data. They use their training data based on the prompt that they are given or the instructions they're given to create something that is likely to be what you're looking for. Finally, we'll be spending most of our time talking about a subset of generative AI programs called large language models. So these are things like Chat GPT, Claude, Microsoft Copilot, Google Bard, Meta AI. All of these have their own affordances and limitations. And those affordances and limitations often depend on whether you or students are paying for them, and they will change over time. So I'm not going to spend time today, comparing and contrasting different AI tools. We'll be thinking at a sort of a broader level about large language models in general as they currently exist and as they're likely to exist in the near future. But as we're thinking about this, you should keep in mind that there are some important variations between large language models. They vary in whether they can operate without an internet connection. They vary in whether they can search the internet for answers or whether they just rely on their training data. And they vary in whether students can upload documents like, say, course readings or outlines or assignment guides to the generative AI program and have them respond to prompts by telling them specifically, please respond to this document. So some LLMs can do that, some cannot. So the large language models have more capabilities than even people who were close observers of the field a few years ago thought that they would by this point. They can now produce texts in many genres. It can be difficult to figure out what texts were written by AI and what were written by humans. Much vaunted AI detectors simply don't work reliability. And their capabilities continue to grow and are difficult to predict. And this has led some observers of AI in education to predict that writing is over. We don't need to give written assignments. They're futile and useless. LLMs can do all this for us. And what I want to suggest is that that's not really very true. I can't tell you what things are going to look like in a year, but LLMs have many disadvantages when it comes to writing that are unlikely to vanish soon because they are baked into the way that these programs are structured, developed, and trained. So these include problems like the black box problem. We don't know why an LLM makes the outputs that it does. This makes it in some ways, a limited partner in writing because we can't investigate its processes in the way we could investigate the thinking of a person we were writing with. It tends to fabricate facts. This is called hallucination by people in the field, though I prefer to simply say it's fabricating or it's lying. Uh, and it can be very difficult to weed out those false facts or to prevent the LLMs from producing falsehoods in the first place. LLMs have systemic biases. They're built into the training data. So a particular pernicious kind of falsehood, which tends to reinforce broad stereotypes about people that are built into its training data. Finally, they have difficulty with the very specific kind of analysis and creativity that we most want students to practice. They are highly unlikely to get over any of these disadvantages anytime soon. So while I think it's safe to say that generative AI tools will change how many of us write, they are very unlikely to end the advantages of writing for us or for our students. So even given the presence of LLMs and their wide availability, it just makes sense to continue to ask students to write. We just have to change what we're asking for and how we're asking for it. Given that, we're going to move now into this three-pronged strategy for addressing the presence of large language models in our classrooms. The first prong is to think about how we motivate students to write. Writing can allow students to develop skills that are the specific kinds of skills that generative AI has the most trouble replicating. So in a way, writing is a very beneficial activity for students when it comes to preparing themselves for a future in which large language models are going to be more and more present. The issue is, of course, that some students will always do the work because they're intrinsically interested. Some students will never do the work. They'd rather pay someone or use a large language model or just skip assignments and actually do the work because of their own priorities. But there's a large middle section of students where we can do a lot of work or we have a lot of opportunity and challenge to convince them that it is in their best interest to do writing assignments rather than offload those assignments to generative AI. And that's what we're going to be talking about how to do. I find that it's easiest to approach the question of student motivation by thinking about what writing does for us. Writing is a technology. It is not a technology that is shared by all human cultures at all times. There are many ways to learn to think, to remember information, to become a subtle, to develop a subtle mind and develop analytical reasoning skills. But writing does have particular advantages. It allows us to reflect on our ideas and revise them. It allows them to express ourselves to people who aren't right in front of us at this time. And because of that capacity it has for reflection and revision, it's particularly good at helping with analysis and argumentation. We can write down our first impressions about something, and we can return to those later and sharpen and refine them. So if you could indulge me, before we talk about how to communicate motivation to your students around writing, let's think about what writing does in your particular disciplines. So how does the technology of writing or these kinds of qualities of writing play out in your discipline? What in your field does writing help students to get better at specifically? And take a few minutes to put that in the chat. So thinking about a particular audience, planning or mapping out a course of action, demonstrating that you've learned something, developing self-reflexivity, synthesizing research, helping to read more precisely by taking notes, development of a position, evaluating of evidence, preparing for industry models for ways they'll have to write in the future, organizing thoughts. Great. So writing allows for all sorts of things. And when we are communicating to our students, it can help to pause and think about why exactly we have them write in the first place, so that as we are speaking to students, we can clarify the connections between the writing assignments that we're giving them and these very skills we've just talked about: creativity, synthetic reasoning, learning to use models that are necessary and useful in their field, learning to read better, learning to revise and revisit their own thoughts. These are all things that students will miss out on if they offload their writing to LLMs. And it can often matter in subtle ways where in the writing process they offload their thinking. So for example, if I ask an LLM to draft me an entire argument, I'm missing out on everything that goes into synthesizing an argument. Whereas if I have created an outline and I ask an LLM to write a few paragraphs from that outline, maybe I've done some of the steps of thinking. And it's not an easy question to decide where and how we should put limitations on student use. It is, however, regardless of where we put those limitations, beneficial to talk to students about, the fact that you're not just making writing assignments for your own health, that there is a purpose that you have that is specific to your field and to the ways you want them to develop. It can also be helpful in a related note, and I'm so glad we saw the point about industry specific kinds of writing. It can help to rethink what kinds of genres of writing we're asking for. As much as possible, it can be helpful to and motivating to students to see their writing rooted in a genuinely rhetorical situation that has a specific audience, a specific purpose, and a specific medium. So for example, writing a white paper for an NGO that makes a kind of recommendation based on evidence, or reflective writing about creative practice, or preparing a draft of a journalistic article. Many of us in teaching default to forms of writing that are rarely seen outside of education itself. So the 5-paragraph essay, or to the kinds of writing we do in our own work, like academic research papers, which might or might not be what students are coming to your class to learn how to do. The closer of a connection there is between the student's motivation for spending this time with you here in this place and the kind of writing that you're asking them to do, the more there's going to be a motivation for them to engage in the writing process. The third part of motivating students is to help them prepare to be experts. One of the characteristics of LLM writing that has emerged as we've spent more time with these programs is that their outputs are usually far less impressive to experts in a field than they are to lay people. to give you one example, LLMs are quite capable of writing reams and reams and reams of poetry that would impress people who don't necessarily have a strong grasp of poetic form or of the place of meter and rhyme in verse. However, someone who has those expertise, those is acquainted with those topics, would tend to find the poetry written by an LLM to be much less satisfying. It doesn't have the sense of rhythm and sound that human poetry tends to. This plays out across all fields because the nature of LLMs is that they are designed as generalist programs that can answer a wide variety of uses. This means that it can be helpful to motivate students to spend class time on helping them to become experts. I'm sure many of you already do this in your classes, but at this moment, it can be helpful to revisit and revise your syllabus to think about how much time you're giving to that. For example, it can be worth it to cover less material in order to spend more time teaching students how to read an argument closely, how to reason analogically from one case study to another case study, or how to detect the ins and outs of rhetoric in a piece of argumentative writing. Reading together, reading in small groups, reading with texts that are projected up onto the screen. All of this can help you, as an expert in the field, slow down and communicate to the students what the steps of thinking are that you probably don't think about most of the time because they've become second nature to you, but which students need to develop and think about in order to become the kind of experts who will simply be less impressed by what an LLM puts out and better able to do better. This is particularly important with research projects where I find that it can be particularly helpful to scaffold students' work with guidance on locating reliable sources, a discussion of how to integrate sources into an argument. So in your field, how do you bring in a primary or secondary source, and how should that be related to the argument? And which you can do with help from your subject area librarian. So you're not alone here in having to do a whole series of lessons about research yourself. But if you are going to do a research project, you might need to spend some time making students expert at doing research, particularly in your field. So those are ways that you can motivate your students to want to not use generative AI or to want to do the writing themselves. And that can be a powerful force in the classroom. But it's also worth time to think about how to structure the assignments so that they reward students who put in the work and who engage with the writing process, but will less reward students who use generative AI. I want to say at the outset that I'm making some quick generalizations as I go here about how generative AI tends to perform. In many cases, a student could get generative AI to perform in better ways and to come closer to human performance in the ways I'm describing. But that itself takes a great deal of work and usually expert knowledge in the field that they're trying to get the generative AI to quote unquote speak to. So it simply is from a certain perspective, it might be a different way of students approaching the same learning goals. Rather than a sort of workaround or cheat for students to use generative AI in them. So the first way of doing this is to think about process and reflection. We were just talking about the value of writing for helping us revisit our thinking and sharpen our thinking over time. Students, however, can feel oppressed by the tyranny of the final product. They just want to get that good grade. They want to make the excellent essay. And LLMs seem to offer them that in a sense, right? The problem is that LLMs are completely black boxes. We have no idea why they do the specific things they do. There's no way to open them up and look inside and say, oh, they made this decision because of this. That is the opposite of the characteristic of human writing, which is iterative, which revisits ideas over time. And so Incorporate that revision and revisiting of ideas into the assignments. Make it worth marks for students to write in class, whether it's a exit ticket to say, this is what I understood from class today, and this is what I have questions about, or whether it's ready reactions to readings, or even collaborative writing and brainstorming in a group. You can also design final assignments so that they have to include portfolios of revised work and reflection on process, or just a portfolio of outlines and drafts and other stages of writing, which even if you don't build in due dates, like the outline has to be due by this date, the proposal has to be due by this date, can still come as part of the final product to show you a student's development in their thinking over time. This encourages students to invest in the idea of writing as a process, writing that is not just about getting to a particular finished product. In response to the ways that LLMs write, which is with a sort of voice from nowhere that has only a general idea of any contexts, I would also encourage you to think about ways that you can relate writing projects to specific rich contexts. So for example, if I ask a large language model, as I have in the past, to respond to a particular dilemma as a TMU student or as a resident of Toronto, it becomes quite apparent quite quickly that the large language model doesn't really know very much about Toronto. It will reference the size of the city or the fact that it's an urban environment or the fact that it's cold, but doesn't have a nuanced sense of what it means to be in a specific place. Students, on the other hand, are in very specific locations. They are here with you at TMU for a reason. So you can think about ways to have students demonstrate their understanding of larger course concepts using local context, be it local legal cases or specific neighborhoods or specific communities and archives. This can work for other locations in Toronto as well. I'm not saying everything needs to be about Toronto or TMU, but specifying a context for projects makes them the kind of projects that are going to seem more meaningful to your students and which humans will do better at than LLMs. You can also, if you're dealing with more sort of abstract ideas in a course, require students to connect their writing on essays and assignments to conversations and problems that are raised in class. You'll likely have to teach them how to cite a lecture or cite a conversation, but this encourages the idea that they're not just writing out into a void and they're not writing for academic publication. They're writing to you and to their classmates, responding to the problems and issues raised in your class in the specific way that you teach your subject. All of these are things you can ask of your students fairly because they're there with you in that context. Whereas a large language model is in a data center in Texas somewhere. Finally, the third prong of the strategy is to do what I call tuning your rubrics. So think about how to adjust your rubrics to reward human skills while de-emphasizing the things that LLMs tend to be good at. The goal here is that if a student uses an LLM in an improper way, or in a way you've authorized, perhaps, they don't necessarily do any better and in fact might perform worse than a student who simply does the work themselves, even if the student who does the work themselves produces what looks like a less polished final product. So the first way of doing that is to look through your rubrics and look through your assignments and think about what the most advanced skills you are. So to think back to the concept of helping students become experts, what are the skills that you've been now spending class time on, you've been scaffolding their development in, you've been talking to them about the importance of? Those are the skills you can emphasize in your rubrics. These are, not coincidentally, the kinds of skills that large language models tend to not do as well at as humans. They'll produce texts that are grammatically flawless and reasonably well organized, but texts that struggle to present creative solutions or to analyze problems and questions in a specific way. So I would encourage you to think about how to more heavily weight those higher order skills in your rubrics and maybe assign less importance to features of writing unrelated to your course goals. So assuming that your course goals don't include, say, grammatically perfect writing or absolutely spot on organization, there are ways that those can matter for a course, right? I'm not saying that's never the case, but if those aren't major course goals for you, it might be more helpful to downgrade those in importance. So a student who engages honestly with the course material and has a creative and thought out essay that maybe has an imperfect command of English or an imperfect command of how to structure a paper will ideally do better than a large language model text that might look superficially smart or well organized, but actually is a bunch of empty verbiage that doesn't actually address the problems that you want students to address in the class. So when I'm talking about these more advanced skills versus less advanced skills, I often find it's helpful to return to this image, which I'm sure you've all seen many, many times. If this is your first time, Mazel Tov, you've managed to avoid seeing it so far. This is Bloom's cognitive taxonomy. It is a way of organizing stages, so what are thought of as stages of learning, and we can debate whether that's actually a very good way to think about it. But it's a way of categorizing things that students do with the idea that things that are lower down on the pyramid are necessary for the higher levels, but are also easier to master. So it's at these highest levels of the pyramid, analyze, evaluate, create, that we tend to see the biggest difference between human and computer performance. So I find particularly helpful versions of Bloom's taxonomy like this one, which have verbs tied to them. The idea is that those are verbs which might appear in your goals. So that you know that if you are, say, asking students to argue or defend a position, that is a form of evaluation. So I would recommend going back through your goals for your assignments, going back through your rubrics, and thinking about what are the things that fall higher on this pyramid, and would it be worthwhile to weight those more to reward students who are engaging honestly with the course content. I would also recommend that you do some revision of the language in your rubrics to get more specific about higher order skills. So I have run a lot of assignments through large language models. And one of the things that I've noticed when I'm asking them to do assignments that are close to my own field is that I can see that they're producing things that look like an argument or look like analysis, but they tend to dwell in generalities. And they tend to not have a clear idea, particularly of how to relate evidence to an argument. So, for example, if I'm asking a large language model to answer a question drawing on several primary historical sources, it will often A, fixate on one or two parts of those sources, sort of in isolations, and sometimes misread the entire context. And B, even if it gets the context right, it will tend to be very general about how it relates that source to the larger argument. So, for example, it might quote a long chunk of a Puritan sermon and say, this demonstrates the communalist ethic of Puritans. Well, what is the this here? Right? It is in that step of saying this line of the poem, this incident in the case study, this specific rhetorical move in the argument. This relates to the argumentative point I am trying to make, because that kind of spelling out of how the argument is functioning and how it's based on this evidence tends to be where large language models shy back because of the specific way that they're put together. So I would recommend taking that kind of specificity into your rubric. Spell out when you are looking at say an essay in your field and you think this is good, This is not so good. This is okay. What is going into that judgment? And try to be as explicit about it as possible. This has the bonus of helping you when you're marking, helping your TAs or GAs if you have them when they're doing their marking. And if you choose to communicate your rubric to students, helping them understand what you're looking for. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. If I were drafting a rubric for a historical paper, I might have a line of my rubric that is about the use of primary sources, right? So my draft version of that might say something like, well, an A paper will fully use sources, a B paper will use relevant sources, and a C paper will make cursory use of sources. What I'm trying to do here is revise towards a way of describing what relevance is, what it means to make full use, and what cursory use looks like. So for example, when I say that this paper makes full use of relevant sources, I mean that each step of the argument refers to a specific source and clearly explains why each source matters to the specific point being made in this paragraph and to the larger point of the paper. And it is in that very specific step of argument building that I tend to see differentiation between students, and in which I also see differentiation between my actual human students and large language models in a student hat. Finally, I recommend that when you are designing your rubrics and your assignment guides, you be picky about sources. LLMs can read uploaded texts and can write in a pretty convincing or pretty accurate way about them, but they often hallucinate sources, that is, make sources up entirely, or get facts about those sources wrong. For example, I once had an LLM do an analysis of Tennyson's Ulysses, in which it decided that the famous closing line of that poem, to find, to seek, wait, no, yeah, there we go, to find, to seek, to strive, not to yield, was the first line of the poem. So that it tends to get those kinds of facts wrong or to make up sources wholesale. And so I recommend that you spend class time on citational practices and standards, and that when students cite sources, you ask them to provide links, ideally to a library webpage, so that if you have a question about a source, it takes you a few seconds to verify whether it's real or not, as opposed to sending you off on a wild goose chase to find an article which might not even exist. So I think I've left us some time for discussion. So thank you for your attention. If you have specific questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to put them to the chat. We have about 15 minutes for discussion.